But unfortunately, it's become this almost again habituation now to only consort with those who are sort of on your side, whatever that means, and it often is defined in terms of beliefs.
Mm,
Like we should have gay rights, or we should have
mm,
or all abortion is murder, or or
mm,
whatever, just something, right? And that takes the place of thought. It
mm,
just takes the place of thought, and it prevents you from being challenged in your beliefs or your views of the world, your mental models of the world, by others who may have a different mental model or a different set of beliefs. That's how
mm.
we grow. We grow through challenge. We grow intellectually through exchange with others who don't believe the same things we believe and are prepared to explain why.
Mm.
And instead, we are in this culture where if you don't believe the same thing I believe, or if I think you believe something different than what I believe, I'm just going to resort to canceling you or labeling you, pigeonholing you as a granny killer or, a
Mm.
neoliberal Trump cannot death cult warrior, as I was called. So, it's this thought stoppage. So one thing that can be done
Mm.
is stop stopping thought, let thought live. Talk to people in your grocery store, in your park, in at the cinema or whatever. Just actually try to have a real conversation with them.
Welcome to another dialogue with Propaganda in Focus. In these times of what seems so much like coordinated global campaigns of controlled destruction and dispossession, we might sometimes stand completely aghast and dumbfounded by what to do to rebuild society and civilized culture, and to regain our natural and civil rights and our agency. It's often said that everything is politicized, and this seems to resonate especially clearly in these days. But if that's true, I think we can also make an equally compelling case that everything is economized. With the fast approaching tax schemes on carbon dioxide, our taxes on oxygen and water falling from the sky, and even spoken words not far behind. Imagine taking courses in the near future from AI bots on the economy of human worth. What would it take for students to pass that course? To probe these and related themes, we are joined today by Gigi Foster, Professor of Economics at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Dr. Foster is a veteran academic who's done undergraduate studies in ethics, politics, and economics at Yale University, and doctoral work in economics at University of Maryland. She is a true interdisciplinarian who brings together laboratory practices and research across education, policy, corruption, social influence, time management, and behavioral economics. She is widely published in leading scholarly journals and is co-author of the timely book, The Great COVID Panic: What Happened, Why, and What to Do Next. And that book is published by the Brownstone Institute. So, Gigi, thanks so much again for taking time out and to join this dialogue. We have lots in common, so I'm really interested in hearing your perspectives.
Thanks
To
for having me
begin,
on. It's a great pleasure to be on your show and talk with you about stuff. Always a pleasure to meet somebody else from Pittsburgh.
yeah, we can talk about that too. To begin with, I framed our talk with a kind of reference to controlled demolition. But is that just hyperbole? Are we really seeing a kind of controlled demolition of personhood, family, community, society, economy? We can talk about so much. What do you?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we can talk about so much. I think my discomfort with the phrase controlled demolition is that it implies that somebody's doing the controlling And I cannot tell you who that person is. I do not think it is a single person. I think it is essentially, as an economist, of course, I'm always thinking about incentives. And I think what's happened is we've had the development of a lot of antisocial incentives over the last 20 to 30 years. And those are all conspiring to produce behaviors on the part of elites, but also on the part of common people, which are not positive, not optimal for the welfare of humanity, basically. And so we have a lot of bad things happening in all those different areas that are, I consider bad because I want to see humans thriving. Now, not everybody will consider them all bad. If you take something like, let's say, social media addiction, for example, right?
Mm.
The development of technology and the way in which technology has been integrated into our everyday lives, which has itself been the product of innumerable little decisions made by all sorts of people at different levels in the society and different professions, whether or not to control it, whether or not to put some kind of self-discipline in place, whether or not to have a set of rules about it, or whatever. The way that it's being used would be very pleasing in the short run for some of the people using it. But I also see very negative long-term consequences from that sort of phenomenon really permeating our society as much as it has. And so again, you say controlled demolition, and I don't know, demolition is also kind of extreme. It's like the entire thing will be razed, right? I mean, I'm a little more hopeful than that, I guess. I feel like, yes, there's an attack. Absolutely. It feels like one is under siege sometimes,
Mm.
right? It
Mm.
feels as though so many good and true and helpful and joyful things are under attack. But I don't have a particular boogeyman in mind, a specific person to
Mm.
blame and to throw, just to shoot arrows at. I see it as a systemic problem that we all have to try to solve together. And so,
Mm.
from my perspective, the most important first step is to wake people up to what they are losing, because often they don't see that. They're so
Mm.
in the reeds, they're so close to the coalface, they're not really paying attention to the broader implications of the various phenomena that they're living amongst.
Yeah.
And once people's awareness is raised, then you can start to try to activate them in whatever way they feel comfortable with and they want to be activated in order to try to stem the outflow of these good things. So
Mm.
that's been a large part of my motivation.
Yeah. I was reminded when you referenced incentivization or systems of incentivization. I think it was quite recently, Senator Massey has come out advocating for redress of grievances because of what's being uncovered during the COVID hysteria and programs of incentivization that big insurance companies, I'm sure you're aware of this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a huge problem, and that's just in the material realm, right? So when
Yeah.
we talk about incentives, or when I talk about incentives, at least as an economist, I'm thinking about anything that drives people's resource allocation decisions. And resources are not just money. So incentives are not just money. Incentives can be love, can be loyalty, duty, sense of who you are, wanting to be psychologically safe, wanting
Mm.
to have a positive relationship, all sorts of things, wanting more status. That's a big one. So many, many things can drive our decisions about how to spend our scarce resources. And our scarce resources include our money, but also our attention, our mental focus, our energy, our time, our kind of, anything that's scarce and can produce something positive, right? And so
Mm.
that's very, very broad. And I know it's broad. And so some people think, oh, well, is that really economics? I think it is, because if we are trying to understand allocation decisions that individuals make that affect the economy and that
Mm.
affect society, we have got to understand those incentives, those different things that are in the hearts of men that are driving them to do things that they do. So for me, that is a primary, just overarching question I always ask about any situation I'm looking at. Where are the incentives? Who is facing which incentives? And those incentives can flow from monetary things like you were talking about, but they can also flow from power. They
Mm.
can flow from our own psychological situation. Like for example, right now, I think 6 years after the COVID madness began, we see a lot of people on the street and every day in the grocery store or whatever who really do not want to talk about COVID. Why? Because for them, seeing clearly what happened during COVID would
Mhm.
entail an admission that they did things that really deeply hurt people they love. and that deeply hurt their society, and that damaged things, big intangible things like trust that are underpinnings of a healthy society. And it's just too much of a psychological shock. They don't want to
Mm.
accept that. So unconsciously, they are protected, right? Their unconscious mind protects them from that shock by
Mm.
saying, "Oh, no, no, la, 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 we won't talk about that." And you can try to confront such people with evidence, but generally speaking, it will fall off like spaghetti from Teflon. So that is an example, right, of an
Yeah.
incentive that's there, but it's very much, psychologically driven. It's not about money. You can pay these guys $1 million. They still wouldn't want to face the realities there.
Yeah, it's seems to be more evidence of the theory of cognitive dissonance. Difficult to face these two opposing, bodies of evidence. The material evidence that has been presented to us over the past 5, 6 years, and the the theory of this menacing virus that's set to annihilate.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and that one is more easily dismissed. I think the two bodies of competing evidence that the protagonist in my story was sensing and feeling anxious about were sort of, on the one hand, all the things that happened during COVID, all the policies, all the responses, etc. The things that actually they did and that the
Mm.
rest of the society did. And on the one hand, and the notion that this was good. And then on the other hand, the notion that they have of themselves as a good person, right? Because they want those two things to be in accord, right? They sort of want, oh yes, I did good things, and that was part of the COVID response. COVID response was good. I did the good things, and right. So that's the harmonized story. But when
Right.
you start to introduce cracks in and that start to make it dissonant, because you say, well, maybe those things that happened during COVID weren't so good. Maybe they're actually, and the evidence is coming out now. You see it sometimes in the even in the mainstream evidence about censorship, evidence about vaccine side effects, evidence about lockdown effects, that were
Mm.
negative. No real evidence for the lockdowns ever really being a valid public health intervention in the first place, et cetera, et cetera. So the more that evidence accumulates, the more dissonance
Mm.
potentially is opened up for this person, right? And it's
Yeah.
their own image of themselves that they can't reconcile with this flow of evidence, right? And that's much, much more important to them than whatever a government official would have said at the time. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're based in Sydney, and I was my advisor, my doctoral advisor is in Melbourne, and I
Yeah.
talked to him very early on, and he was very shocked by the extreme, I guess you'd call it madness that was being stirred up in public discourse there. So I was wondering how different was it, do you think, when your book came out, the differences between those two states, New South Wales, Victoria.
I mean, I didn't visit Victoria during COVID until I think it was probably 2022,
Mm.
when I was flown into Melbourne to take part in yet another ABC Q&A, which is a national sort of talk show thing,
Mm.
evening, like 60 Minutes type thing, but it's with, live people on a panel stage kind of thing. And I was on that show maybe 4 or 5 times during COVID as the only person who was anti-lockdown, essentially. And so I was flown into Melbourne then, but I didn't see it in 2020 and 2021. What I know from my research is that, of course, Melbourne was one of the most lockdown places in the world,
Mm.
despite the fact that it really didn't have much COVID by international comparison, even if you take PCR tests as evidence of having COVID.
Right.
Um, and also in Sydney, in New South Wales, there was plenty of terror. There were plenty of people going around making absolutely mad statements and behaving like mad people. I remember being confronted by the producer of my radio show at the time in 2021
Mm.
at the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Company Corporation. So we had this show called The Economists, and I was quite keen to keep coming into work and doing the recordings there. And I wanted to talk about vaccines, which were just
Mm.
coming down the track. And I thought, yes, it'll be great. But this woman, this producer, I mean, she would have no bar of it at all. Gigi, we don't want your anti-vaccination views, your anti-vax or whatever she said views. Not that I'm anti-vax, I'm just pro-health, pro-consent and, informed consent and things like that, like traditional things. Um, but also, she was saying, oh, you can't come into the office because what if I catch COVID from you because you're not vaccinated, you're not planning to get vaccinated. What if I catch COVID from you and then I give COVID to my son who is in some way immunocompromised, regardless of the fact that she and her son presumably would get the vaccine. So
Mm.
if that were protecting them, then that was protection, right, from
Right.
anybody like me. But there was this whole nonsense narrative about, well, we have to protect the unprotected using the protection that didn't protect the protected. It's just completely nonsensical, right?
Right.
But she was absolutely deadly serious, right? Deadly serious. I mean, really, really like not yeah. I'd never been spoken to so firmly by her about anything. And so it's sort of I just
Mhm.
kind of threw up my hands. So situations like that, I had to say, well, your mind has been hijacked. Essentially, that's what it looked like to me. The minds
Mm.
were hijacked by the logic of the crowd. Whatever it was that the crowd was saying at that moment about vaccines or face masks or tracking and testing and tracing or PCR tests or hospital overrun or whatever it was,
Mm.
that was the line that was going to be spun. There was no actual brain activity being used by individual people as autonomous agents
Yeah.
to comb through data that they were being exposed to. That normal process of thinking, to the extent that it is normal, because I must say most of the time our brains are just engaged in justifying what we already want to do. But to the extent that you try to actually think about your world, that just wasn't happening during COVID on the part of many, many people. I would say the majority, vast majority of people I met during the peak madness period. So
Mm.
2020, 2021, whether you were in Victoria, whether you were in New South Wales. Now, I have heard stories that, in the really remote areas, it wasn't as bad because, farmers just have to get on with things. They can't be dallying around with stupid, face masks and turning off, like not sending their kids to school. I don't know. So I'm not sure. I didn't travel around, partly because we couldn't travel around back then. But there are some really, people I really admire a lot, investigative journalists who have tried to piece together stories of what happened
Mm.
during that time in
Mm.
Australia. So we have had a book called COVID Through Our Eyes, which was a publication from Robert Clancy and Mel McCann. They edited it, and they had a whole bunch of different perspectives in there,
Mm.
told by different types of people, sort of like the Great COVID Panic. I mean, these are later than the Great COVID Panic, but more kind of about the human story in Australia. Now,
Mm.
and then there's another book that's coming out soon by a lady who used to work for the Daily Mail named Alison Bebbage. She now drives a bus. And she's been a terrific investigative journalist during this time. And she, I know, is going to be detailing some of the human stories. And we've had some human stories from the COVID vax side effects and things like this. So there are people who do this. There was one called Australia Breaks Apart, which was a very emotive, very heartfelt story of what happened during COVID from the perspective of a guy named John Stapleton. So we have had our kind of folk heroes, I guess, in the
Mm.
restoration movement, or resistance initially, and now restoration movement in Australia. But yeah, certainly, it's definitely true that, as in many cases around the world in the West, you just had people completely going mad during that
Mm.
period, and the fog of war has now usually lifted for most people, but they still don't really want to face what happened.
Mm. Yeah, I think what you're describing, it reminds me a lot of what I've witnessed in Japan. The power of, gaslighting operations, and I still haven't seen some of the faces of my colleagues, for the past 5, 6 years. Have I can't remember what they look like because their faces are covered with masks 24 hours. Well, every time I see them on campus. But are you still are you seeing this sort of like obsessive compulsive behavior in?
Yeah, I mean, we have seen people with masks on occasionally, but I would say it's very unusual to see it in our department now. If you do see it, and maybe it's 5, 10% of the time, my general thought about it is it's probably that person has decided that this is the correct thing to do when they get sick or something. They've kind of, as a holdover, spillover effect from the COVID stuff of, oh, if you start sneezing, you should wear a mask. Not that you should, but that's
Mm.
they've somehow taken that as a lesson away.
Mm.
Because those same people you'll see with a face without a mask at other days, right? So it's a temporary thing. So I think that may be it. We also have a reasonably large Asian population here in New South Wales, and on campus particularly, we have a pretty large Asian student population. And there already was, even pre-COVID, this sort of social habit, I guess, of the Asian people from some countries, certainly China, and a couple of other ones, I think, to wear masks when they feel sick. I don't know if that's true in Japan, but that definitely has sort of been a constant here. Even before COVID, we would see students with masks on sometimes, and
Right.
I thought it was a bit weird, but it is a cultural thing. It's like rinsing your nose with water, or going and spitting every time that you feel sick. Some people, some cultures just have different ways of, I guess, thinking that it's correct to deal with things, taking your shoes off before you go in the house, versus walking around with your shoes on. It's kind of a cultural thing. And yeah, some of it is inefficient, and probably not very effectual.
Mm.
But I think that sort of thing, that sort of cultural holdover is very different from kind of mass madness,
Yeah.
where people are wearing the mask not because they learned when they were a kid that that was the right thing to do when you're sick, but because they are petrified that if they don't wear a mask, they're going to kill their grandmother or something.
That's an appropriate term, mask madness.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so we can talk about, I think, various ways in which we might maximize, effective responses to all sorts of, ongoing madness, whether it be social or economic, political, medical. I was reminded, you were saying something earlier about free speech and, rights to keep and bear arms. In Australia, the political madness that we're seeing. What's the what are your thoughts on what's happening regarding the Bondi event?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as your audience will know, we had a mass shooting at Bondi Beach in mid-December, and as a consequence of that, there's been a political response which has restricted both speech in terms of strengthening what we already had on the books as hate speech laws, and also expanding that and calling it anti-hate speech and anti-Semitism or something. Um, and also restricting laws around gun ownership. So fewer guns per person, more limitations on the types of guns that you can have, etc. So, it just seemed to me that the reason why this thing in Bondi happened was neither it was not addressed very well by either of those freedom restrictions. And freedom restriction has generally been the go-to response by governments to um, very complex problems that they don't really want to address structurally over
Hmm.
the last few years, and that includes COVID. And because it's really hard to address a structural problem, I mean, what are you going to do about, for example, in the case of the Bondi situation, people who were not citizens, at least one of them, getting guns that were legal to own, and also preparing for months in advance to do this mass shooting. Yes, they were Islamic, and yes, they had a cause. Um, and we have immigration policies here in Australia, which let huge numbers of people in, and there have been increasing, numbers of people saying, well, we need to block everybody who's coming from X country or Y country. And you can imagine that's pretty politically combustible, right?
Right.
And so the government really don't want to go there, it doesn't want to pass a law or have a conversation even about that because it might fall afoul of its own original hate speech legislation. And if you talk about a whole group in a particular way, this is one of the problems with hate speech. The notion of hate speech it's sort of can be subjective, and certainly the revised rules make it even more subjective. So it's like
Hmm.
somebody has to believe that the person might have been triggered by the blah blah. There's no trial, there's no parliamentary oversight, there's no jury, there's no conviction. It's just somebody believed that maybe somebody else could be offended. I mean, geez, oh man, talk about a
Hmm.
walk away from standard principles of judicial, fairness in the
Right.
West
Right.
generally. So anyway, in response to this, one of the people from the United States who contacted me through another contact here happens to be the international expert on the link between gun ownership and crime rates. His name is John Lott. He's the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center in the United States in Salt Lake City, Utah. He said, "Look, I want to come to the United to Australia from the U.S. for a week of speaking engagements. Can you arrange these for me?" And so I basically set to work putting that schedule together for him, which included a couple of speeches, talks, engagements with my free think tank called Australians for Science and Freedom, scienceandfreedom.org, which I co-founded back a few years ago with a number of other people who were disenchanted with the COVID response. It's
Mm.
cross-disciplinary and very community oriented.
Mm.
So we had a couple of events with him there, and then we also, reached out to other bodies we thought might be interested, like the shooters unions and the libertarians and Students for Liberty and Turning Point Australia, and these other bodies that sort of seemed like they'd probably have something in common with this guy. And
Mm.
and when he first came over, I said to this to people, I was not sure where I stood on the point of gun ownership, really, because the only two experiences, I mean, despite being a Yankee myself, the only two experiences I've ever had with a gun were both quite negative. In one case, I found a loaded gun in my father's dresser drawer with a piece of paper on it that said "loaded, do not touch." I was about 8 years old. I, had opened the drawer looking for his car keys after he'd sent me upstairs and I couldn't find him on the dresser. So I looked at myself in the mirror, above the dresser, and I said, "Oh, I could kill myself right now," or, "I don't want to be a statistic." And I just closed the drawer and came downstairs. I've never told him. Hopefully he'll never see this podcast. Because, that was pretty scary for me as a little child, but I also, did the right thing. Fortunately, I could read. Fortunately, I was a sensible child. And then another one time, I was 19 years old. I was held up at gunpoint, by, as it turned out, an 11-year-old black girl in Washington, D.C. at about 10 o'clock at night, and robbed. And they found her later that night. She was just marauding with a bunch of other kids in a gang. So, that was not a pleasant experience.
Mm.
So I kind of, and I've never shot a gun myself. I've never even held a gun. When I see a gun, I start to feel a little anxious because I start thinking about the damage it could do, I suppose. It's just one
Right.
of those things. You look at a weapon, you think, oh, geez, that's a dangerous thing, right? It's like seeing I don't know, a dangerous chemical, sitting on a bench in a science lab. It's like, okay, better be careful of that thing, right? That can burn somebody. So I wasn't really sure what I thought, but I don't like the idea of freedom restrictions just as a push button response to a crisis that is
Mm.
multifaceted, complex, emotive, and clearly requires a lot of discussion, which is just exactly the sort of thing that the government here at least does not want to deal with. So I had this guy out. ASF supported him, and I thought, he does science. And he is speaking freely about what he finds. He's an economist, he's a PhD economist, and he basically finds that every country in the world that has restricted gun rights has seen afterwards not a decrease in the homicide rate, but an increase. And violent crime in general tends to go up. And why? Because in his mind and his experience and his research over the last 20, 30 years in this area, 30 or more than 30 years actually, has told him it's basically because gun ownership by civilians is a deterrent against crime. Would-be criminals think about what target to hit based on which targets are least protected. And so they're more likely to hit targets that they know are not being defended by armed civilians. So, for example, in the US, we think of the US as being this, gun crazy place. And it is true that the gun homicide rate in the US is greater than it is anywhere else. But, as far as I know, but at least in the West, only 1% of crimes, even violent crimes or something, I think, are gun homicides. So you're talking about a whole, small fraction of total crimes that could be visited upon people.
Mm.
And a lot of those crimes are deterred by citizens owning guns. For example, school shootings. There's never been a school shooting, as far as John Lott knows, at a school where there has been a sign that says some teachers and faculty members, whatever, are carrying guns in a concealed manner, right? The school
Mm.
shooters, the would-be school shooters, they want to rack up a big body count. These guys are incredibly, maladjusted, dysfunctional people, right? They're
Mm.
suicidal. They want to
Mm.
get a huge body count. They want to get a lot of media attention, and they know if they're stopped by a gun, they're not going to get that body count. So they target places where they think they're not going to be stopped. So, that kind of story, we've had that story told in multiple different sort of scenarios here in Australia to different audiences, including some politicians. And it was really refreshing just to have that perspective aired,
Mm.
because I don't know if you've found this in Japan, but I mean, we have definitely had a massive decrease in the ability of civil society to basically be civil with each other in conversation about complex social issues.
Right.
It's hardly ever the case anymore that there
Mm.
are real, serious, real deep discussions about difficult things where the answer is not binary. with people participating who are across the aisles from each other initially and
Mm.
genuinely want to work towards a solution. Just hardly ever happens. So.
Mm.
So yeah, I thought from that perspective it was a great thing to bring him out. I think he was happy with his visit. But that's an example of the sort of thing that I try to do. I'm trying to reacclimate Australians to a few things, a few roles and ways of behaving that they have lost. The role of being the steward of your own way of life, that has been
Mhm.
lost, right? They have outsourced that to the government, and the government is doing a pretty bad job of it. They have lost the behavior of speaking cordially and openly, and yet still thinking by themselves, thinking autonomously with each other. So, this notion that you might have a civil conversation with somebody who has a different position than you do on, gun rights, or take something else really emotive, abortion, or what's that thing, anesthetic, when you go when you die, uh, getting somebody to actually opt for their own death by taking medicines that will kill them, right? That sort of
Euthanasia.
thing. Yeah, yeah. So anything
Mm.
that's really emotive and people will have very strongly differently held views.
Mm.
It's just extremely difficult to get them to come to the table together and say, yeah, okay, I really want to have this conversation and I would like to see where we are similar. Like, for example, take abortion. I
Mm.
think if we got the people who would define themselves as pro-life and define themselves as pro-choice, however you want to think about those terms, because I think it
Mm.
means, I'm not sure how to define those terms, but if you take these people from very different points on the spectrum, put them
Mm.
together, I think there's a lot more that people will agree about than disagree about. I really think there's a lot more. And there are certain actions, policy actions, that they think they would all agree we should take. Supporting pregnant mothers. I just
Yeah.
think that is an obvious one, right?
Right.
Um, and there's a bunch of other things you can, big topics where we could get to some kind of agreement and start to rediscover our own responsibility to solve our problems rather than having the government
Mm.
tell us what the solutions are, because
Right.
it's usually wrong.
It seems as though, at least in my direct experience, looking back over the past 40 years plus, the education system in the West and the media system seem to work together pretty well to create populace that is disinclined to entertain very complex ideas. And it seems as though we've been trained more or less by these systems to just react with emotion rather than to have, as you say, cordial conversations about these complex issues. And I think that's
Yeah.
especially so over the past 6 years. The sorts of psychological operations that have been unfolding in societies. We're conditioned, it seems, to simply react rather than to reason.
Well, I think that's right, and I think again, go back to incentives. Talk about incentives in the media space. We have this saying, if it bleeds, it leads, and any company in the media space will want to maximize the dollars it gets per microsecond of engagement, right? And so the easiest way to do that is you lead with emotion, you get people to get fired up, and then they're more likely to want to read more. Oh, that makes me angry. Read more. Or oh,
Yeah.
geez, oh, that's so sweet. And so they don't want to engage with our brains. That's not profitable. It's not just not
Right.
profitable. Look at the traditional publishing industry. It's collapsed, right? I mean, we had a massive consolidation of the publishing industry like 10 years ago.
Mm.
Um, and it's still really difficult for independent publishing houses to make a buck. You have so many people who are printing their own books. Self-publishing has become so big, partly because there isn't the kind of patience and publishing has become just squeezed so much
Right.
because there's so much competition for people's attention and people's money in the space of entertainment and things, information feeds. And that's been driven in large part, I think, by the rise of these new media forms which have discovered how to milk people optimally for their money using their heart.
Mm.
And so unless you actively kind of prevent yourself from getting sucked into those things. I mean, I've never
Mm.
been on most social media, for example. I've never had a Facebook account, a Instagram account, a Twitter account. I just don't have those things. Unless you actively take steps to protect yourself, you're going to get sucked right along into that system, and you're going to be a peon or a vassal in
Mm.
that grand scheme of profitability. Basically, is driven by profitability. I mean,
Right.
again, you could say yes, there's a psyop. Sure, okay, the government has lots of incentives to hunt, and in all sorts of ways, it was absolutely horrific. But again, I just look at the incentives for the media companies, right? And the incentives for the schools. You mentioned education. Well, I mean, I'm here sitting in a university. You're in a university there. Um, what does the university want to do? Well, it also wants to get a lot of profit, wants to get a lot of money so that it can pay its leaders a lot of money. We get full fees from our international students, so we want as many international students as we can, credibly accept. And that has led to problems as well. And it means that we've massively increased our numbers on campus, which means the destruction of community. It
Mm.
means very much more difficult to have deep, conversations in tutorials or sections or any
Mm.
classes because there's
Mm.
just too many people, and most of them don't speak good enough English to be able to have a really challenging, deep, complex conversation, nuanced conversation about something, that's not easy. And again, they've been brought up on TikTok and Facebook and whatever, so they're brought up not to be in the habit of thinking
Mm.
deeply. So we have these people who have been dishabituated from thinking properly and deeply about things with nuance. And then we have environments that they come to which further discourage them from doing those things. So is it any wonder that our young people have what has been termed internet brain rot? And it's not just from the internet, it's brain rot generally from the context in which they find themselves. And so then it's those people who are going to carry the future of the West. Right? We need to help those people. We need to help those
Mm.
people. And that then motivates, yeah, my interest in actions in the area of trying to revive higher education, including with Academia Liberamentis. You interviewed Paul Freiders, I think, the other
Mhm.
week,
Yeah.
and he's the academic director there. This is a new university in Belgium, and they are trying to rediscover what Western education actually used to be and used to be able to provide because of the design features that he's
Mm.
trying to resurrect there.
Mm.
Small community, everybody's there together, integrated teaching, um, not this kind of accreditation game where you're always filling out forms, but professors in charge and student reflective and student reactive teaching. A lot of things that we just don't have the capacity to steward anymore in huge universities.
Yeah. I like the getting back to the art of oratory and rhetoric, thinking critically, asking questions, and thinking through thoughts, taking time. It reminds me of conversations I'd have with some colleagues years back about the destruction of our values as human beings in consumerist cultures. And, I think about this a lot, especially when I'm writing, as, the core values that we have, how they seem to have changed quite considerably. Growing up in the 1970s in Pittsburgh, and we didn't have like, the malls, the big malls and the conspicuous consumption that came in the 1980s. It seems that those ideas about being a dutiful citizen and a self-realized person, a human being, was largely oriented toward what can we consume and how does that material consumption, what does that say about our value in society? But,
Yeah,
like, I can remember my mother and father always pushing back against that and the value of, family and
yeah,
trust and, producing things in the garden. And
yeah.
yeah, I do like that idea of the new university project that Paul and you talking about.
Yeah.
So how can we apply that in our positions
Yeah, yeah,
as
no, exactly.
academics?
And
Yeah.
that's the challenge, right? How can each person, whether it's you or me or somebody watching, how can we actually do things that are positive, that lead to or contribute to the rediscovery of the things that we know we've lost? And I would say, by the way, it's not quite so as usual. Things are not quite so bleak as they appear. It used to be the case as well hundreds of years ago that people engaged in conspicuous consumption. In fact, if you look at the economics literature, a book called The Theory of the Leisure class defined that term, conspicuous consumption, by Thornton Veblen. This was in the 1800s sometime, right? I think, and it was, it's people basically buying stuff just in order to be watched as they buy it or as they consume it and
Mm.
have the time available to consume it, which is time they don't have to spend working, which then betrays the fact that they don't have to work for a living, which betrays the fact that they're rich, right? I mean, it's this whole social status signaling story, right?
Right.
And and I will say my mother was actually quite a social climber herself. She enjoyed her material things much more than me. She was, much more into, the sort of bourgeois situation. I'm not sure she would have called toilets commodes, but that sort of direction. My dad was not. He was from the South. My mom was from the North. My dad was from the South. And
Mm.
my mom was a lifelong Democrat, and my dad was a lifelong Republican. So I sort of got put in the middle of a lot of different things, which was great for me because I saw things from so many different perspectives. She was a psychologist, he was an engineer.
Mm.
And that really, really benefited me. If I had just had, and I didn't realize it at the time at all, but I think, that exposure to multiple perspectives is something I really valued from my childhood. And
Mm.
that's another thing we've lost. We
Mm.
just surround ourselves, whether it's virtual or real communities, they tend to be ones that are just made up of people who believe the same things we do, or at least we believe that they believe the same things we do. They
Right.
at least have broadly similar beliefs. And it's never true. I mean, I always like to say this, at a church or a march or anything. It's just never true that the guy next to you believes exactly what you believe. Forget about that
Mm.
idea. He just doesn't, right? Everybody has
Mm.
their own specific little ways of,
Idiosyncratic.
defining their little beliefs. Yeah. But unfortunately, it's become this, almost again habituation now to only consort with those who are sort of on your side, whatever that means, and it often is defined in terms of beliefs.
Mm.
Like we should have gay rights, or we should have,
Mm.
or all abortion is murder, or or
Mm.
whatever, just something, right? And that takes the place of thought. It
Mm.
just takes the place of thought, and it prevents you from being challenged in your beliefs or your views of the world, your mental models of the world, by others who may have a different mental model or a different set of beliefs. That's how
Mm.
we grow. We grow through challenge. We grow intellectually through exchange with others who don't believe the same things we believe and are prepared to explain why.
Mm.
And instead, we are in this culture where if you don't believe the same thing I believe, or if I think you believe something different than what I believe, I'm just going to resort to canceling you or labeling you, pigeonholing you as a granny killer or, a
Mm.
neoliberal Trump cannot death cult warrior, as I was called. So, it's this thought stoppage. So one thing that can be done
Mm.
is stop stopping thought, let thought live. Talk to people in your grocery store, in your park, at the cinema or whatever. Just actually try to have a real conversation with them. Ask them about what they think about a particular issue, and then gently sort of don't, respectfully, don't be like, well, that's stupid, obviously, but oh, that's interesting. I always thought blah. And try to rediscover for them the joy and the power, the insight that one can get from having a conversation with somebody who's not absolutely 100% aligned with them on exactly
Mm.
what they think. Because it's incredibly boring to be surrounded by those kinds of people, right? If you're
Mm.
surrounded by people who only agree with you, it's about as boring as being the most powerful guy in the world, who is always surrounded by everybody who, just basically says yes all the time. How boring is that? So
Right.
the way to get away from that is you put on a mask and you go into the commoners, villages, and you actually have real conversations.
Mm.
That's life, that's life. So I think that's one thing people can do, no matter what their profession, no matter what their skill set, just try to have, open people's mind, allow thought to take seed again, and
Mm.
interest and excitement, you know. Um, and then obviously, I think that the biggest way we can all push back against the authoritarian overreach, the tyrannical sort of behavior of people in power, is to claim that power ourselves. Because the only reason that those people are in power, in democratic states anyway, is because we have implicitly ceded power to them. So if we say, well, we don't like what you're doing and we would like to take back some of that power, well, that will create more power for us. It will remind everybody that the real power resides in the people. because that is where the real power resides. So I try very hard to build community. So these, community events that we have at ASF, and just having, social events randomly with friends, self-insuring in a way.
Mm,
In fact,
mm,
I'm living that right now in the area of housing because my husband and I we had to leave our rental because the owner wanted to sell. And we've been bouncing around across different families. We were in Avalon, I think, when we last spoke, Danny, and that
mhm,
was a house sitting for some friends of ours up there. They came back, and then now we're in another house, right? And so we are actually insuring ourselves. If we didn't have this friendship group, we'd have to be paying for our accommodation every night, right?
mm,
But these
mm,
friends are perfectly happy to use spare bedrooms here and there to house us. You can do the same thing with health. If you know any doctors, just
mm,
put yourselves in that situation, and maybe you're a, I don't know, carpenter. You can get your weird growth on your hand looked at by the doctor, and the doctor can maybe get his cabinet fixed by you, right? So that's sort of just handling it in
mm.
out, not
Right.
monetizing and not saying, oh, well, I better, call the council to figure
Yeah.
out what's going on with my block. Just handle it. You can. And if you do, then that brings back within the community the responsibility for the kinds of things that the community for generations took care of
Mm.
without spending so much GDP.
Right,
And the
right.
governments are now spending like 30% of our GDP. It's ridiculous, right?
Right.
So we need to reclaim a lot of that stuff that the government doesn't do as well. Government is needed for some things, of course, right? But it's just completely overreached its remit, and it's doing things that essentially the communities have abrogated responsibility for when they really shouldn't have. That's
Mm.
not optimal for, human thriving. So how do we reclaim some of that? Well, we just start doing it. So yeah, I would say start a community group, start figuring out how you can self-insure. Maybe you've got some chickens, you can provide eggs, and everybody else can provide whatever they have, tomatoes if they can grow those, or basil or whatever. And then you can just
Mm.
get around a lot of these big systems. And that provides competition for those big systems, right? As soon as
Right.
there's a competing outside option, the person who was previously enjoying a monopoly, which is often the government, suddenly feels competition, and they have to get their house in order to stay in the market. And they may have to reduce the size of their industry because they just don't have that market share anymore. That's exactly
Mm.
what we want. That's how you reduce the size of anything. You take away its market share. So that's another piece of advice.
That's excellent. I think related to what you're saying, it reminds me of the value that we at least tacitly put into the earning of, wages. And
Yep.
economics, as you said earlier, is not necessarily just about monetary gain or expenditure, but there's a there's an economics of, time and our values and whatever is of value to human beings,
Yep.
human culture, family.
Yep.
Uh, Maybe we need to really broaden our understanding of what economics really is.
Well, there is a whole literature, and this is probably another, podcast or two. There's a whole literature on the non-monetized economy. So, a bunch of people, Nancy Fulbray is one, but there's so many people studying essentially the value of things that are produced in a non-monetized fashion, which includes often meals cooked in the home, cleaning that is done in the home, not for money, childcare, elder care, etc. And by some estimates, the value of those goods and services produced in a non-monetized fashion exceeds those that are produced in a monetized fashion. And
Mm,
I would say generally the process of development since certainly, the late 1800s has
mm,
been increasingly, sequentially, secularly, the replacement of non-monetized mechanisms with monetized mechanisms. And so
mhm,
we've seen, our rising GDP has not just been because we have actually pressed out the production possibilities frontier and are able to do more with less, but it's also because we've turned into visibility some
mm,
activities which were previously invisible because they were being done non-monetized. And in fact, one of the reasons why GDP didn't go backwards in some countries between about 1970 and 2000 or 2010 is because women entered the labor force. And so you got people who were previously doing a lot of non-monetized activity suddenly coming in and adding their talents to the labor force. And so that was, in part making a lot of things visible, and also in part being allowing markets to access a wider pool of talent because you had half the labor force that was now, available
Mm.
that hadn't been available before. Maybe not half, but a third. So anyway, all was just to say, yes, this is a very important area. This is one of the reasons I'm interested in time use. And I think that we have gotten to the point where we've really pushed the envelope as almost as far as it can go in terms of monetizing things and getting value from monetizing them,
Hmm.
um, getting real human value from monetizing them. I mean, we get GDP value, but that's pretty hollow if you're not really making people better off. If people
Right.
are better off, I mean, childcare is a great example. I think a lot of women really benefit from using childcare. I certainly did. But I think there's also a fraction of women who really would rather stay home with their kids.
Mm.
And they get this social message that that's sort of, second class citizen material. And they should, if they really want to be a real modern woman, whatever that means,
Mm.
they should use childcare, get a job, bring in some money, and then have economic power over their husband who would otherwise be toxically masculine to them and maybe abuse them or God knows what, right? And that's not a happy and positive message. That's a divisive message. It's a message that devalues care provided in the home by the mother to the children, which is
Mm.
one of the most ancient roles of women ever, right?
Right.
So it's sort of why the pressure? Like I have nothing against women who want to have a career and are able to do so with happy children and use some childcare. As I say, I put both my kids into childcare when they were 5.5 weeks old, part-time childcare because I was in grad school. I didn't take a day of maternity leave and I've
Mm.
managed to raise them and they're doing okay, right? But that was okay for our family. Not every family wants that or can do that and
Right.
was lucky enough to have the situation to do it. So we shouldn't be forcing everybody into a one size fits all just because it's monetized, just because it puts women into this, supposedly economically powerfully, preferred position. And by the way, women have lots
Mm.
of power even if they don't have a job. Right? Women
Totally.
have an incredible amount of social power. We
Yeah.
provide the next generation. I'm sorry, mic drop, right?
Yeah.
That's why men, with respect to my interlocutor, that's why
Mm.
men have to, find some way to contribute to the world and find meaning in their lives. Unlike women who kind of already have their meaning inbuilt, yeah, we can
Mm.
have the next generation. That's just pretty much irreplaceable. And it is, I
Totally.
think it's one of the major reasons why male suicide rates are higher than female suicide rates, particularly, well now, but it's always been the case. But I think in some some sort of situations now, it's worse because men feel that their role has been usurped by women as well. And they're not valued as much, but even from being boys, they're not valued in the school system.
Mm.
They don't attend school as much, as the girls do. They don't aren't as successful. So I think our society, if anybody, is failing the men.
Mm.
But that then in turn fails the women because women want strong, confident men, I mean that we
Yeah.
need, right? So anyway, we talk about all of these things for a long time, but
Mm.
yes, all of that is to say I agree with you. I think that's another area where people can sort of reevaluate, I guess, what value really means. It's not just dollars. It is, are you making your life and the lives of those you know and love better by
Mm.
engaging in this activity?
Yeah, I would argue that it's not principally dollars, that it's since human beings are naturally social creatures, that the economy of human relations uh, surmounts, what we would traditionally look to, well, the ways in which we're conditioned in culture, which is go out and earn as much money as you can and
Yep.
attract, a mate and so forth and so on
Yep.
by virtue of, your bank account or your
Yep.
investment portfolio. Yeah, I come down on the side of maximizing our social relations as social creatures.
Yep.
And yeah,
Definitely. And we know that relationship quality is one of the big drivers of well-being. And if you underinvest in your relationships, you tend to be sad. I mean, these guys who are doing the mass shootings, they tend to have pretty bad relationships. They tend to feel unappreciated. They tend to be suicidal because they don't feel like they belong. That's often the case. And if you read their manifestos, which this guy John Lodoff has
mm,
poured over, it's very clear they have dysfunctional relationships. So yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it isn't money in and of itself. Money is very useful for certainly again for men for attracting mates because it's a signal of financial security that women do look up to, and so that's very handy. But it certainly isn't the thing we're going for. It's certainly not what I'm maximizing. If I were, I wouldn't be an academic, I can tell you that.
I'm with you. Yeah. So To maybe this, we've covered this already, but to what extent do you think education systems are at the center of the struggle for, real freedom,
Yeah.
agency?
I mean, if I think broadly what is meant by education systems, we mean also what goes on in the home, not what we were just talking about,
Mm,
how children are raised in the home, how they're raised to value things, value each other, how they're raised to communicate. And I think that is unbelievably important, just unbelievably important. And rituals can help with developing that, as well as just taking the time, taking the scarce resources and devoting them to the education and support of your children's ability to think, to critique, to find joy in thinking, to find joy in communicating with each other, to find joy in supporting each other and sacrificing for each other.
mm,
Um, and I see this, funnily enough, I mean, the thing that first pops in my head was when I have a weekly family call with my two kids who are around the globe and their dad. And it's every time when somebody has a problem, we listen to the problem and then everybody basically just there's no like I don't nobody says, okay, how are we going to solve this problem? It's just, somebody says that they have a problem and then we all start thinking, okay, how can we help solve this problem?
mm,
And and they'll also sometimes say, well, is it really as much of a problem as they're saying, are there other ways to think about this other than as a problem, and there's so many different ways of supporting and strengthening the person who's in strife. And that's just incredibly it's a relief. It's a breath of fresh air. It's a soft place to be able to go and be like, yes, I have support here. And it reduces everybody's sense that they have to rely on the government, right? Or on any large body. And so it just takes away some of the excess power that has been concentrated into hands that may not be the best hands to solve these kinds of problems over the last, decades. And so, and it makes you feel like you've got a role as well. If you can see for your own, through your own eyes that you are helping another human being
mm,
with his or her, problems in life. It is amazingly positive. I mean, this is
mm.
basically what I live for, right? I mean, this is the
Yeah.
intrinsic motivation that drives me. I love to feel that whatever I'm doing is helping people to
Mm,
just have an easier time, have a more joyful time, have a more enlightened time, and realizing more things about their world and then being able to apply those lessons to improve their lives and the lives
mm,
of those around them. And that's just, it's so far from a mindset of desperation and dysfunction that would drive you to violence or
mm,
extreme selfishness, and so far from boredom. It's so far from, just a lot of these vices that end
mm,
up creating negative dynamics in our world. Even doom scrolling. Why would I want to doom scroll or drugs or anything like that? I find that those things have zero appeal because they don't lead to anything that I know will make me happy, you know?
mm,
And so yeah, teaching your kids, where does happiness really come from? It comes from your relationships. It also comes from finding a way to contribute to your world that you find meaningful. For me anyway, it's meaning as defined by a positive impact on my fellow humans. But that plenty of other people, they'll get a sense of meaning from doing something they think their God would approve of, let's say.
mm,
And as long as it's a God who, doesn't want to kill everybody who, is of a particular race or creed or whatever, then, that can work too. Um, I like to, I guess it's an intellectual challenge always to sort of work through in your head, well, if I take this action, what's the effect going to be? Is this going to be on net positive, on net negative, in the short run, the long run, on which people,
mm,
it's the right action to take? Um, and I enjoy that, it keeps my brain active on something that to me is very meaningful and it keeps me engaged with my life. So yeah, I think that education component, starting from when they're young, have dinner every night together,
mm,
talk about everybody's day and just go through and not just describing, but, synthesizing, analyzing, make some jokes, always good to
mm,
have humor, really helpful. And then, of course, throughout the primary, secondary, tertiary levels, yeah, there are a lot of issues, a lot of problems, again, often resulting from misaligned incentives to demonstrate things
mm,
like demonstrating that we are inclusive or whatever. and then ending up having to reteach the Aboriginal contribution to every single subject in every single year. In Australia, we have this problem. And that's just it's going to cause backlash. It's not that there were no Aboriginal contributions to anything. Of course there were, and it's very interesting. The culture is interesting, but it's only one thing amongst
Mm,
all the things that kids need to know. And so that sort of hyper virtue signaling, which has now infected the curriculum here, crowds out a lot of other things like, your times tables and phonics and, you know, learning about civics and the world around you, geography. So, we have to kind of, again, rediscover what actually is important
mm,
for our children to know in order to discover how they are going to contribute to their world.
mm. Very nice. I love that. Getting back to what it means to be a human being.
Mhm. Yep. Yep. No, it's true. I mean, some people would say, no, being a human being is, I mean, it's enough to just be sitting there and saying, I think, therefore I am. I mean, I get bored with that, I guess, like
Mm,
I did take philosophy when I was, in university. And it's perfectly like I find it somewhat interesting to imagine, well, is that chair really there? Am I really here? Or is this just some crazy thing made up by my mind? And yeah, okay, fine. But at the same time, as you're pondering all these things in your armchair, there are people out there suffering and dying. So how about maybe getting out of the armchair? I don't know. Like it's a little self-indulgent, right? It strikes me. And once you make your peace with it, you got to make your peace with the existential, dread and all sorts of stuff like that. Make your
right.
peace with it and then move on. And then you can be useful. If you're going to be just like obsessing about it all the time, you won't be useful anyway. So you got to spend some time dealing with it. But
Mm,
then I would say just move on.
yeah.
And yeah, that then it's a very practical attitude though. So some people I maybe not wanting to be quite so practical, but there's also space for things like art, for example, music
Mm,
and visual art. I mean, if that's your talent, we need more of that. We desperately need more of that. We need more satire, we need so many things that are very creative. So I would encourage people to produce that stuff.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
Being human.
Yep. That's right. Also being human.
Dr. Gigi Foster, thank you so much for the talk today.
That's my
Uh,
pleasure.
Please send me some of the recent work that you've been doing. We'd like to promote your recent books and also links to the think tank that you were talking about earlier so that we can post that in the show notes.
Yep, I will do that. And I will also say to your audience, watch this space, scienceandfreedom.org. We will soon have an announcement about a very exciting restoration project that will hopefully be very inspiring for people. I couldn't announce it on today's show, but it's coming down the track very soon.